Greetings, my name is Vincent and welcome. In this episode, let's practice painting some Legio Astorum body panels before we move on to a full house of Titans for Adeptus Titanicus episodes in the near future, here at Bunker 6. Bearing in mind everything you're about to see is an experiment, there is no real plan, I was just making things up as I was going along. But as always, you've got to prime your model first, and then to create a first layer of stars, I decided to put my airbrush on very low pressure, and just started spurting some white paint onto the pads, as you can see here. The lower the pressure, the bigger the stars are going to be, and the higher the pressure, the smaller and more like an airbrush the stars are going to be. With higher pressure, I dabbed on the airbrush to create a more compacted constellation of stars towards the center of the pad and left the outskirts as they are. This is also quite similar to a zenithal technique where you'd use the white paint after you've done the priming to create a sort of highlighted area that you'd then use transparent paints to paint over to create higher contrast. And that's actually what we're doing here too, but instead, the stars are going to be a combination of a zenithal technique and also being used as stars themselves. This will be very background stars because we'll be adding new layers of stars later on once we've added some more blue tones to this. Now I'm creating a dark blue tone just to take us away from the black a little bit, but we'll be adding more and more blues lighter as we go along throughout the video. Now the paints have all been diluted a heck of a lot, so I'd say 60% thinner to paint in this instance. Now obviously each paint is different in its consistency, but I would try and keep it thin as possible just so you still have those stars cutting through. You don't particularly want to lose any of that definition in the stars that you created in the second step. Now as you know, most pictures that you get back from space are black with a bunch of white stars, but then you get these beautiful pictures that have long exposure times where we get to see nebulas and things like that. So I'm adding these additional colors just to subtly make reference to those pictures where you see a lot of different colors that cut through in these long exposure pictures. And aside from anything else, it just looks more visually interesting if you have a few different colors floating about. But obviously you want to keep them complementary. You don't want to start throwing lime greens around and colors that don't make particularly too much sense in the context of which you're painting in. And due to those limitations, you also want to make sure that you're still following the theme of the Titan house that you're also trying to paint. In this instance, the Legio Astorum has this lovely shimmering blue texture to it that is supposed to emulate stars. And of course, that's what we're trying to do here. Now, for a majority of this video, my pads are actually quite dark, but I do eventually end up brightening them up and getting them closer to the original reference material. Because I wasn't paying attention to the reference material, it stayed way darker than it should have done for as long as it did. So always make sure that you're keeping an eye on the reference material so you don't make the mistakes that I did. And as you can see, I've used an ivory and a regular crisp white to do the stars. I think that's also good because that helps the eye realize that there's more than just one color in the stars as well. Now I wanted to create a vignette, and I was doing that with Drakenhof Nightshade just to reintroduce the contrast that I felt was starting to get lost in the constant airbrushing that was happening. Definitely one thing that I took away from this process was less is more. You want to take as much time as you can. Don't go hard with the airbrush, which is very easy to do, but always make sure that you're just doing one step at a time as slowly as possible and as effectively as possible. You don't want to have to fix too many mistakes by blasting out paint where you don't want it. I actually did that on one of the pads with the purple color, and it was quite frustrating to get things to look natural again. So just take your time. Now sadly at this point I thought I was actually done with the blue, but as I said previously, I wasn't aware of how dark I'd made the pad compared to the reference material. So I started doing these outlines prior to the metallic stage, even though really those black lines should have come much later after I'd brightened up the pad. And as you can see here, I'm actually just very delicately adding some dark blue back in where I feel things are a bit too bright in terms of the stars. Not the blue itself, but just the stars. So I'm trying my hardest to bring up the contrast by introducing some darks and lights right next to each other. And it was by this point that I realized that I had made the pads too dark, so I went in with the appropriate colors to bring up the blues and make them much closer to the reference material that I was using. Now we're just moving on to the trim, which is quite standard fare here. We're just using Retributor Gold, and then we're going to be going over with a couple of washes around the rivets, and then start highlighting with a combination of brighter gold and silver. You'll probably need a couple of coats of the Retributor Gold before you move on to your next step, and I also recommend keeping them thin because you don't want the paint getting chunky around the rivets, which can quite easily happen. Now, painting in metallics can be quite tricky at first, especially with the stickier, thicker Games Workshop metallics, but just thin them down and you'll be fine. I'm using quite a knackered brush here to do the washes around the rivets because you don't need anything particularly fancy. You're going to be doing some cleanup anyway, making sure that shade looks like it's really sticking around the rivets rather than spreading out like it generally tends to look when you just dab it on with a paintbrush. Now, as you can see here, I'm using a finer brush just to do the finer shade. I obviously wanted the shade to become more acute with a darker shade around the rivets directly. Once we've done that, we're going to be moving on to the cleanup stage. But at this point, I think it's worth mentioning, always make sure that you either clean your pot thoroughly after working in metallics, or even better, have a separate washing pot for your metallics. And just make sure that you don't have any of that metallic material left on your brush before you start moving into different paints, because those metal flakes can get all over the place and really ruin a paint job when you don't want it to. Now, to make the gold very extreme, we're actually using a very, very bright silver here on the rivets and around some choice corners of the trim. If the bright silver is looking a bit too unnatural, then you can always add a wash over the top of it again. Now, this is where the space painting pretty much finishes, but I also wanted to try my hand at some freehand painting and some stencil work. This is possible because these panels are so big. The real estate that you have to work with here compared to a lot of other Games Workshop models is fantastic for trying these ideas out. Additionally, I also just love the cartographic nature of these symbols that are wrapped around the Legio Astorum. We have lines and circles, and all these sort of interstellar images that look like they're navigating and establishing where things are in the universe. Now, one thing I learned from doing this freehand is I need to make everything thinner. Everything was quite fat and chunky, but I think if I actually do end up doing some freehand on the actual Titans, everything has to get tighter and thinner, most definitely. But I'm glad I did this experiment. It's very important that you try and broaden your horizons on each paint project. Give yourself a new challenge each time just so things don't feel stale. And in this instance, obviously I've never really tried stenciling, chopping up masking tape and attaching it and applying it to a model and making sure the results are clean, but it was well worth the time. And time is definitely the key factor here. If you want to be doing any freehand work, I will say time is... You better make sure you have some of it because this takes a very long time. Even something that looks as simple as what I'm doing here takes hours because you've got to do all the cutting and prepping and making sure that the curvature is all matched when you're putting the tape down so you don't end up with an odd shaped line. And also I was trying to figure out how I wanted to do the circles. The circles were much more difficult without a circle cutter compass that I didn't have at the time, but I have ordered that for when I actually do want to take on the Titans, and hopefully that will give me some tighter results. And talking of tighter results, obviously that just boils down to time spent, and I didn't want to spend forever on this because it was just an experiment. And here are the two finished pads. One has room for transfers and one has obviously got freehand work on it. I'm so glad that I did this experiment because it's taken a lot of pressure off doing the actual Titans for me. I hope that you learned something from this too. Well, thank you for watching. I think that's bolstered my confidence in painting some Warhounds and some Warlord Titans in the very near future in this Legio Astorum style. But as always, I'm Vincent, and until next time, I'm signing off from here at Bunker 6.